30 years, 3 full decades building the image of the most lovable man in Hollywood, and somehow it all shattered in less than 10 seconds. That's the kind of moment people replay again and again, asking the same question. How does a reputation that strong crack so fast? Some celebrities just entertain people, but a rare few make the whole world feel safe for a minute. They make you believe hard work wins, that kindness is real, and that the smile on camera is the same smile behind it. For years, Will Smith sold that idea better than almost anyone in the business. He was the proof of the dream, a broke kid from West Philadelphia who could step into any room on earth and instantly light it up. People felt comfortable around him like they belonged there too. That energy made him one of the most liked stars on the planet. But everything changed the night the world saw a side of him he spent his whole life trying to hide. So how does a kid who promised himself he would never repeat the violence he saw growing up end up standing on the Oscar stage in front of millions? Doing exactly that? What was really happening inside a marriage that looked perfect from the outside? What did the entanglement reveal that 3 decades of fame couldn't keep covered up? And why, when you look closer, was the slap actually the smallest part of a much bigger story? To understand all of it, you have to rewind the tape. Back to West Philadelphia. Back to a young kid who figured out early that a smile could be armor, and once he put that armor on, he never really learned how to take it off. Willard Carroll Smith Jr. was born on September 25, 1968 in West Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Not the polished Philadelphia from history books and tourist photos, but the one filled with cracked sidewalks, loud corner stores, and neighborhoods where people learned early that surviving the day mattered more than chasing big dreams. He was the second of 4 children raised by Caroline Bright, a strict but caring school administrator whose rules were clear and whose love never wavered. His father, Willard Carroll Smith Sr., worked as a refrigeration engineer and ran the house with serious discipline. From the outside, the Smith family looked solid, church-going, and respectable. The type of household neighbors pointed at and said that's how a family should be. But inside the house, the atmosphere could feel very different. Willard Sr. was not a villain, and he was not the type of father who disappeared. He was present, hardworking, and determined to provide, yet his presence carried a heavy edge, a kind of tension that could flip the mood of the room without warning. Young Will often watched quiet but painful conflicts between his parents, moments no child should have to process. Those memories didn't come with loud explanations. They just sat there, heavy and silent, buried deep in the chest where kids often hide the things they don't understand. Over the years, Will has talked about that time carefully, never with simple anger and never in a way that paints the story in black and white. In fact, he has often said something surprising about the man at the center of those memories. He would later describe his father as his greatest teacher. At the same time, his father became both his greatest influence and the source of a deep, unresolved scar. It's a complicated mix, admiration and fear, living side by side. Will respected the man who raised him, but he also spent years chasing something that always felt just out of reach: his father's full approval. From music stages to movie sets to red carpets, part of him was still that kid trying to prove he was good enough. The neighborhood played its own role in shaping him too. Overbrook in West Philadelphia during the late 1970s and early 80s wasn't a place where you could walk around unsure of yourself. People noticed everything. If you looked weak, someone tested you. If you showed fear, the streets picked up on it fast. So young Will figured something out early. If the world was watching, give them a show, make them laugh, keep the energy high and the personality bigger than life. Humor became his shield. Charm became his defense. And that natural charisma turned into protection against whatever the streets might throw at him. His grandmother, Helen Bright, became the steady moral voice in his life. She was deeply faithful and kept journals filled with prayers, scriptures, and hopes for her grandchildren. One day she looked at young Will, already the funniest kid in almost any room, and told him something he would never forget. She said, "Boy, you have a gift. You don't waste it." That message stayed with him for years. Even after the Grammys, the Oscars, the luxury homes, and the private jets, that simple voice from his grandmother could still echo in the quiet moments. At Overbrook High School, Will Smith wasn't known as the most disciplined student, but he was easily the most magnetic. Teachers didn't remember him for perfectly finished homework. They remembered how he could walk into a room and instantly capture everyone's attention. Will had a serious gift for words, not the stiff, textbook kind teachers loved to test on, but the fast, rhythmic language of storytelling. The way he spoke had bounce, timing, and personality. While other people heard music as background noise, Will heard it like a conversation. The rhythm just clicked in his head naturally, like the beat had been living inside him long before the world noticed. That same rhythm led him to one of the most important meetings of his life at Overbrook High School. That's where he met Jeffrey Allen Towns, better known as DJ Jazzy Jeff. Their connection wasn't random, it was the kind of partnership that changes everything. Jeff had serious technical skill behind the turntables, while Will had raw stage energy that pulled people in. Instantly, together they were electric. Not just talented, but alive in a way that made crowds lean forward and pay attention. When they performed around Philadelphia, word spread fast. There were no big promotions or flashy campaigns pushing them. People talked about them because the energy was real, and once someone saw them perform, they told everyone they knew. By the time Will was 17, life forced him to make a serious choice. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology had shown interest in him, and his mother strongly pushed for the college path. The safe route was right there, clearly laid out and waiting. But Will looked at that path and turned the other way. He picked up the microphone instead. It was the first massive gamble of his life, and his parents, especially his mother, had plenty to say about it. To them, the music industry wasn't a solid plan, it was just a dream. But Will believed something deep down that no career counselor could measure. He had this intense, almost stubborn confidence that he was meant to be heard. Soon after, DJ Jazzy Jeff and the Fresh Prince officially signed with Jive Records, and everything started moving fast. Their early music had a totally different vibe from what a lot of hip-hop was becoming at the time. While many artists leaned into darker stories and aggressive energy, DJ Jazzy Jeff and the Fresh Prince brought something lighter, playful, and straight-up fun. They weren't pushing gangster images or chasing shock value. Their style was clean, funny, and full of life, and people loved it. Then 1988 arrived, and everything exploded. Their hit Parents Just Don't Understand won the very first Grammy Award ever given for Best Rap Performance. Just like that, Will Smith was no longer just a kid from West Philadelphia with big energy and a microphone. Now he was a recognized name, a young star, and living proof that his gamble had worked. But there was one thing the Grammys didn't do, that they didn't pay the bills. The money that came with early fame hit fast, and for a teenager who grew up without much, it felt endless. Suddenly there were luxury cars, flashy jewelry, big entourages, and a lifestyle built around the idea that the money would never stop flowing. Reality had other plans. The IRS wasn't impressed by awards, hit songs, or charm from West Philly. By 1990, the situation got serious. Will Smith owed nearly $3 million in back taxes. The cars disappeared. The entourage faded away. Even the record label started losing patience. At just 21 years old, the same young man who had once felt unstoppable was suddenly broke and facing a scary truth. The huge gamble he made on music looked like it might have completely backfired. In that moment, embarrassed, financially crushed, and staring at a future that looked nothing like the dream, Will Smith learned something brutal about fame. The spotlight that lifts you up fast can move on just as quickly. Right when everything looked like it was collapsing, a phone call came in that changed the direction of Will Smith's entire life. Legendary music producer and NBC executive Quincy Jones had noticed something about him. Not just the rapper, not just the Grammy winner. Quincy saw the performer, the storyteller with natural charisma who could control a room just by walking into it. The offer sounded simple but huge at the same time. a brand new television show. The idea was a comedy about a street-smart kid from West Philadelphia who suddenly gets sent to live with his rich relatives in Bel Air. Culture shock, big mansion, fancy schools, and one loud personality shaking up the whole house. Believe it or not, Will Smith almost turned it down. At the time, acting wasn't his plan. Music was the dream, but there was one major problem still hanging over his head. The IRS. With millions owed in taxes and pressure closing in, the choice suddenly became very clear. So he said yes. With that decision, Will stepped out of one life and straight into another. One minute he was a young man trying to escape debt, and the next he was standing on a Hollywood soundstage in Burbank. The kid from Overbrook had just walked into the entertainment machine, and he had no idea he was about to become one of the most recognizable faces on earth. But even with fame waiting on the horizon, there were some things he couldn't leave behind. Not the pressure he felt growing up, not the deep need to earn approval, not the habit of turning every moment into a performance. The boy who once watched tension fill his home had made a quiet promise to himself long ago. He would be the one who brought laughter instead of conflict. That promise followed him everywhere. Every set he stepped onto, every room he entered, every relationship he built, he kept moving fast, smiling bigger, performing harder. Sometimes that smile was so convincing, even he forgot what he was running from. Then on September 10th, 1990, The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air finally premiered, and America didn't just watch it, America loved it instantly. The story was simple and easy to understand. A smart, funny teenager from West Philadelphia gets sent to live with his wealthy aunt and uncle in Bel Air after getting into trouble in his neighborhood. Suddenly, he's surrounded by mansions, strict rules, private schools, and a lifestyle he has never experienced before. It was the classic fish out of water setup for a network sitcom, but the energy Will Smith brought to it made the whole thing explode with life. But there was something no group of television writers could fully script. Will Smith himself. The way he moved through a scene had its own rhythm. Sometimes a single raised eyebrow from him could land a bigger laugh than pages of written jokes, and other times he could suddenly drop the comedy completely and shift the entire room into silence with something honest and real. One of those unforgettable moments came during season 4. Will's father, Lou, played by Ben Vereen, shows up after years of absence. For a short moment, it looks like things might finally change. But then Lou walks away again, leaving his son behind a second time. At first, Will plays it cool, smiling, joking, brushing it off like nothing touches him. The same defense he had used his whole life. But then the mask cracks. Standing there with Uncle Phil, the jokes disappear, and one question slips out that hits like a punch to the chest. How come he don't want me, man? What happened next didn't feel like normal acting. It felt deeper than that. In that moment, Will Smith seemed to reach back into everything he had carried since childhood. Every confusing memory, every moment of silence in his family, every feeling a kid holds when he's trying to earn a father's approval. And suddenly, all of it was right there on screen. James Avery, who played Uncle Phil, pulled him into a hug that felt completely real. Behind the cameras, crew members reportedly started tearing up. And across America, millions of viewers who had tuned in expecting a laugh were left completely quiet. They weren't just watching a sitcom anymore, they were watching a young actor from West Philadelphia pour something painfully real into a fictional scene, and nobody who saw it ever forgot that moment. And in that moment, whether he fully realized it or not, Will Smith revealed something deeper than the bright smile people had come to know. The world suddenly saw there was more behind the jokes. He wasn't just funny, he could be emotionally powerful too. The rare kind of performer who could make an audience laugh until their stomach hurt and then hit them with a moment so real it stayed with them long after the episode ended. That balance became his secret weapon. Comedy, emotion, charm, and raw presence, all wrapped into one performer. It was the kind of combination Hollywood almost never sees in a single person. The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air ran for 6 seasons and 148 episodes. By the time the show wrapped in 1996, Will Smith had grown beyond it. But not with ego. With gratitude. He knew exactly what the show had given him: a massive platform, years of experience, and millions of viewers who already trusted him before he even stepped onto a movie screen. And the moment he walked off that soundstage, Hollywood was waiting. He had already given a small preview of his range in the 1993 film 6 Degrees of Separation. People paying close attention could see something there. Beneath the fast jokes and smooth charisma was an actor capable of serious depth. But then came 1995, and everything shifted into another gear. First came Bad Boys, starring alongside Martin Lawrence. Loud, explosive, and packed with attitude, the movie showed Will could dominate the big screen with pure star power. Then just a year later came something even bigger: Independence Day in 1996. The fourth film was massive, huge action, giant alien ships, and a scale audiences had never quite seen before. It quickly became one of the highest-grossing movies in the world at the time. But the real surprise? Will Smith didn't just appear in the film, he became the center of it all. The energy of the entire movie seemed to orbit around him, and audiences everywhere bought into it completely. The hits just kept coming. In 1997, Men in Black landed and instantly became a global phenomenon. The sharp suits, the aliens, the comedy, the swagger, everything clicked. Will Smith wasn't just acting in big movies anymore. He was becoming the face of blockbuster entertainment. Then the momentum kept rolling. Men in Black 2, Enemy of the State, and a growing list of major films that proved studios could build entire projects around his name alone. But in 2001, Will made a move that surprised a lot of people. He stepped into one of the most intimidating roles imaginable. Muhammad Ali, the film Ali, demanded everything from him. He had to gain around 20 pounds of muscle, study boxing footwork, train like a real fighter, and capture the voice, rhythm, and presence of one of the most iconic figures in history. Some actors had looked at the role and walked away because the pressure was just too high. Will Smith did the opposite. He ran straight toward it. By that point, chasing the impossible had become part of who he was. Playing real-life legends is dangerous territory in Hollywood. Audiences already love the person being portrayed, and they're ready to criticize anything that feels off. But when Will stepped on screen as Muhammad Ali, something surprising happened. Even Ali himself approved of the performance. The role earned Will Smith his first Academy Award nomination, proving he wasn't just a blockbuster star. He was a serious actor too. Then in 2006 came another film that many people believe showed the purest version of his talent: The Pursuit of Happiness. The story followed Chris Gardner, a struggling father who became homeless while trying to build a career as a stockbroker. This time, there were no aliens, no explosions, no flashy action scenes. Instead, the film asked Will Smith to do something much harder: be vulnerable. The camera stayed close, the story stayed grounded, and alongside his real-life son, Jaden, Will delivered a performance that showed a man exhausted, desperate, but refusing to quit. There were no explosions in that moment, no dramatic soundtrack building in the background, just a father and his young son huddled together inside a public bathroom, hiding from the cold and the darkness outside. Will's character whispers that everything is going to be okay, even though you can see in his eyes he isn't fully sure himself. That scene landed so hard because it didn't feel like pure acting. Yes, the performance was skilled, controlled, and powerful, but audiences felt something deeper underneath it: a father, terrified of failing his child, a man fighting the crushing fear that he might not be enough. Those emotions didn't seem far away for Will Smith, they felt real. The performance earned him another Academy Award nomination, along with recognition from the Golden Globes, the Hollywood Foreign Press, and critics across the industry. By that point, the conversation around him had changed completely. Will Smith wasn't just a movie star who could act, he was a serious actor who also happened to be one of the most likable entertainers on the planet. By the late 2000s, his influence stretched far beyond acting. His production company, Overbrook Entertainment, had grown into a major Hollywood force. Will was producing films, developing projects, and building a powerful business machine with the same relentless drive he had always shown in his career. The numbers were massive. His salary climbed to around $20 million per film, and the movies he starred in had earned more than $5 billion worldwide at the box office. That kind of success placed him in rare company. Names like Denzel Washington, Tom Hanks, and Tom Cruise, actors whose reputation alone could open a film anywhere on Earth. But while everything looked perfect at the top of his career, something behind the scenes was starting to shift. His marriage to Jada Pinkett Smith, which began in 1997, was far more complicated than the polished smiles people saw on red carpets. From the outside, everything about Will Smith's family looked picture perfect. Will, Jada, Trey from Will's first marriage, plus Jaden and Willow, all of them together created an image people admired. They were often presented as a symbol of success, talent, and modern partnership. Two powerful individuals building a strong family and a powerful legacy. But appearances can hide a lot. Behind the polished interviews and coordinated red carpet moments was a man who had never really stopped running. Ever since childhood, Will had learned a quiet rule about life. Standing still could be dangerous, but performing could protect you. If you kept people smiling, laughing, impressed, and entertained, maybe everything around you would stay together. So he kept performing. Not just on movie sets or award stages, but at home too. The same high energy that powered his career also followed him into his personal life. He worked hard to keep everyone inspired, entertained, and proud. But even the most talented performer eventually gets tired, and exhaustion doesn't always show itself right away. To the outside world, everything still looks solid. The smiles were still there. The success was still massive, and the family image remained strong. But inside the relationship, both Will and Jada knew things had been quietly shifting for years. Not through loud fights or dramatic scenes, but through slow uncertainty. Two intelligent people who still cared about each other, yet were no longer completely sure what their relationship was supposed to look like anymore. Ironically, the same years that marked the peak of Will Smith's career, the blockbuster films, the billions at the box office, the unstoppable charm, were also the years when something inside the man behind the smile was slowly fading. The Oscar he had chased for decades was still ahead. The moment his grandmother once believed he could reach was finally coming. But when it arrived, everything around that moment would already be on fire. Jada Pinkett was not someone who entered Will Smith's life after he became a global superstar. She knew him before the giant fame, before the billion-dollar movies, before the entire world knew his name. Their story actually started back in 1990 when Jada auditioned for a role on The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. She tried out for the role of Lisa, one of Will's love interests on the show. The producers made a simple decision. She was told she was too short for the part. The role went to someone else, and for most actors, that would have been the end of the story. But something unexpected happened that day. Even though she didn't get the role, Jada got something else entirely: Will Smith's attention. And when Will locked his focus onto something, he didn't easily let it go. At the time, though, things were complicated. Will was still married to Sherry Zampino, the woman he had his first son with, Trey, who was born in 1992. Their marriage eventually came to an end in 1995, closing one chapter of Will's life. Not long after that, his connection with Jada grew stronger. Then on December 31st, 1997, New Year's Eve, the two stood in front of family and friends and got married. The timing almost felt symbolic, like the calendar itself was marking the start of a brand new era. And for a long time, that new chapter really did feel powerful and meaningful. Jada Pinkett Smith was never just a background figure in Will's life. She was a strong presence all on her own. Actress, musician, producer, and someone known for sharp intelligence and fearless honesty. She carried a confidence that matched Will's energy and sometimes even challenged it. Most people around Will were used to his charm. They laughed at his jokes, admired his success, and enjoyed being close to the unstoppable force of his personality. But Jada was different. She didn't treat him like a superstar. She looked straight past the fame and saw the human being underneath, the man constantly pushing himself, constantly performing, constantly trying to make sure everyone around him was happy. She saw the pressure behind the smile, and that honesty was something Will deeply needed. Even if over time it also became something that quietly unsettled him. Jaden Smith was born in 1998, and 2 years later, Willow arrived in 2000. The family that formed around them quickly became one of the most talked about households in entertainment. They were creative, ambitious, and deeply involved in their children's lives. Their parenting style was intentional and different, which brought both praise and criticism from people watching from the outside. They weren't trying to follow traditional rules. They encouraged independence, creativity, and self-expression. For a long time, it looked like everything was working perfectly. But while the public saw harmony, something more complicated was slowly developing behind the scenes. Will Smith has later spoken openly about this period in his memoir and interviews. The same relentless drive that pushed him from a neighborhood in West Philadelphia all the way to global fame came with a hidden cost. The success never seemed to quiet the pressure inside him. The moment one achievement was reached, his mind immediately started chasing the next one. Stillness became uncomfortable. Quiet moments brought anxiety. No matter how many blockbusters he starred in or how many records he broke at the box office, the restless energy inside him never fully settled. Will even admitted something many successful people struggle with. He had become deeply dependent on external validation, applause, praise, recognition. Those things kept him moving. But real intimacy doesn't work that way. True closeness requires someone to sit still, to be present without performing, without the big personality or the polished smile doing all the work. Over time, Will realized he had never fully learned how to exist that way. The boy who once used charm as armor had grown into a man whose armor was almost impossible to remove. Jada noticed it. She spoke about it honestly. And as Will's career kept demanding more of his energy and attention, a quiet distance slowly formed between them, not out of anger, but out of the heavy sadness two people feel when they still care deeply for each other yet start to feel further apart. As the years moved into the early 2000s and 2010s, the distance between Will and Jada quietly grew larger. Both of them have later admitted that their marriage had entered a period of deep separation. Not something officially announced to the world, but emotionally very real. They were still connected by family, by history, and by love for their children. But inside the relationship, things had shifted. Years later, Jada would describe that period in a very direct way. She explained that they had become two people who needed to figure out who they were separately before they could truly understand what they were together. It was a thoughtful explanation, and many people respected the honesty. But behind those calm words was a much harder truth. The marriage was going through serious difficulty. Then 2020 arrived, and the timing could not have been more intense. The entire world was already under pressure because of the global pandemic. People were stuck at home, online more than ever, and paying attention to every headline. In August of that year, Jada appeared on her Facebook Watch show Red Table Talk, sitting across from Will Smith himself. During that conversation, she shared something that immediately shook the internet. Jada confirmed she had been involved in a romantic relationship with musician August Alsina, who was significantly younger than her. She explained that the connection began during a time when she and Will had separated and were trying to figure out their lives independently. Eventually, she said the relationship ended. She described the situation with one word: entanglement. The internet exploded almost instantly. That single word spread across social media like wildfire. Memes, jokes, debates, and endless commentary flooded every platform instead of slowly processing the full story. The online world grabbed the headline and ran with it. Within hours. The carefully polished image of one of Hollywood's most admired couples was being picked apart piece by piece in front of millions of people. For Will Smith, the situation hit in a way that felt deeply personal and painfully public at the same time. For decades, he had built an identity around being the man who had everything under control. The career, the family, the charm, the unstoppable optimism. To millions of people watching around the world, he represented success, stability, and the idea that joy and grace were possible. And then suddenly, that image cracked open. There he was, sitting across from Jada on Red Table Talk, calmly answering questions about a deeply personal chapter of their lives. On the surface, he stayed composed, steady, and respectful. 30 years in the spotlight had trained him to never completely lose control in front of a camera. But people who understood him closely later described the aftermath very differently. Behind the scenes, the months that followed were some of the most difficult of his life. Not necessarily because the relationship itself shocked him. According to what both Will and Jada explained, they had already been living through a complicated separation during that time. What truly shook him was something else. For the first time in his entire career, Will Smith no longer controlled the story being told about him. The narrative was now moving on its own across the internet, through headlines, memes, commentary, and millions of opinions forming in real time. For someone who had carefully managed his public image for 3 decades, that loss of control felt overwhelming. Then things became even more complicated. Musician August Alsina later shared his own perspective in interviews, describing the relationship in a way that many viewers felt didn't completely match the explanation given during Red Table Talk. The different versions of events created even more confusion online, and instead of one clear story, the public was left with a messy situation playing out across social media. At the center of it all was the image that spread everywhere. Will Smith sitting quietly at that table trying to hold together a marriage that had already been under pressure for years, while the entire internet debated it in real time. Later on, Will Smith would speak about that time with surprising honesty. In his memoir and interviews, he described the Red Table Talk episode as one of the hardest days of his life. Not because of betrayal in the traditional sense, but because it forced him to confront something he hadn't fully understood about his own beliefs. He had agreed to a very open and unconventional framework in his marriage. On an intellectual level, he believed in it. He wanted to be supportive, progressive, and generous in how he approached love and partnership. But emotionally, it was far more complicated. Deep down, he was still carrying old expectations about what marriage was supposed to mean. Expectations about being a husband, about loyalty, about protecting something sacred inside the relationship, and suddenly those private emotions were being discussed in front of millions of people watching online. He had tried to be evolved. He had tried to be understanding, but the experience left him with a quiet sense that something inside him had been shaken in a way he struggled to fully explain. The entanglement didn't end their marriage. Will and Jada stayed together, continuing their relationship in the complex and unconventional way that worked for them. But something else ended that year. For 3 decades, the world had accepted a certain version of Will Smith without question. The unstoppable smile, the effortless confidence, the man who always seemed in control no matter the situation. After that moment, that image was gone. What remained was a different version of Will Smith, more vulnerable, more complicated, and far more unpredictable than people had ever seen before. And then another massive moment was approaching. Oscar season was around the corner. A night that would soon make the entire entanglement drama look like only the opening chapter of a much bigger storm waiting to explode on the world stage. The night of March 27th, 2022 started like a victory lap. Will Smith arrived at the 94th Academy Awards carrying the weight of an entire career behind him. For many people watching, this wasn't just another award show. It felt like the moment everything he had worked for was finally coming together. His performance in King Richard had been widely praised as the best work of his life. In the film, he played Richard Williams, the determined father who pushed his daughters, Venus and Serena, from modest tennis courts in Compton all the way to the very top of the sport. This role showed a different side of Will. Not the loud blockbuster hero, not the wisecracking action star. This was a quieter, more controlled performance, a version of Will Smith that appeared when he stopped entertaining and fully stepped into a character. The awards season made the momentum clear. He had already taken home the Golden Globe, the Sage Award, and the BAFTA. Every major indicator pointed in the same direction. Hollywood insiders, critics, and fans all seemed to agree this was his year. After decades in the spotlight, after 2 previous Oscar nominations, after surviving career risks, financial disasters, and deeply personal public struggles, the industry was finally ready to hand him its highest honor. For Will, it represented everything. The long journey from West Philadelphia, the early music success, the tax problems, the reinvention through television, the billion-dollar movie career, and the very public complications in his personal life, all of it had led to this moment. Inside the theater, Jada Pinkett Smith sat beside him, calm and elegant. Cameras kept returning to the couple throughout the night. To viewers at home, they appeared united and steady. 2 powerful figures who had weathered years of public scrutiny and still arrived together on one of Hollywood's biggest stages. From the outside, it looked like the perfect image, a couple that had survived the storm, now sitting together as history prepared to reward a lifetime of work. That picture-perfect moment sitting in the audience turned out to be far more fragile than anyone realized. Partway through the ceremony, comedian Chris Rock walked onto the stage to present an award. Rock has always been known for sharp humor and quick jokes aimed at the crowd. He scanned the audience, spotted Jada Pinkett Smith, and tossed out a quick comment comparing her shaved head to the character in the movie G.I. Jane. It sounded like a short, casual joke, the kind of line award show presenters throw out all night just to keep the room loose and laughing. But there was something important behind that moment. Jada's shaved head wasn't simply a fashion choice. She had publicly shared that she lives with alopecia, a medical condition that can cause hair loss. It was something personal that she had spoken about openly, and for her it carried emotional weight. In a room filled with bright lights, cameras, celebrities, and millions of viewers at home, the joke landed differently than expected. At first, Will Smith laughed. The cameras caught the reaction immediately. It looked like the automatic response of someone used to playing along in a room where laughter is the social currency. But then he glanced toward Jada, and something changed. Her expression looked tight, controlled, quiet, the kind of reaction that doesn't explode outward, but still carries pain beneath the surface. In that moment, something inside Will shifted. He stood up from his seat, calmly walked toward the stage. The entire room watched, unsure what was about to happen. Then suddenly, he slapped Chris Rock across the face. For a split second, the theater froze, the sound echoed across the stage, and the audience fell into a stunned silence that television almost never captures. Thousands of people sat there trying to process what they had just witnessed, unsure if it was real or some strange moment of live television. For a few seconds, nobody in the room seemed to know how to react. Chris Rock, to his credit, stayed standing and tried to keep the moment moving. Meanwhile, Will Smith calmly walked back to his seat. But what happened next made the situation even more surreal. From the audience, Will shouted toward the stage, twice telling Chris Rock to keep his wife's name out of his mouth. The entire theater sat frozen while millions of viewers at home watched in shock. Yet somehow the broadcast kept going as if the show could simply continue. But outside that room, the world had already exploded. Within minutes, clips of the slap flooded the internet. Every angle, every reaction, every facial expression was replayed again and again. Social media filled with instant opinions while the ceremony was still happening. And then something even stranger happened. Less than an hour later, Will Smith's name was announced as the winner of the Academy Award for Best Actor. He walked onto the same stage where the slap had just happened and delivered an emotional speech. He cried, spoke about love, mentioned faith, and compared his role as Richard Williams to the idea of protecting family in a difficult world. Under different circumstances, the speech might have been remembered as powerful, but now the moment felt incredibly complicated. Some viewers thought the speech sounded disconnected from what had just taken place. Others saw it as a man overwhelmed with emotion. Many people watching were simply confused, trying to understand how such a dramatic moment could be followed by an acceptance speech only minutes later. The emotional swing from confrontation to tears to gratitude left audiences unsure how to process it, and in that moment, the Academy did nothing. Will Smith stayed in his seat, remained part of the ceremony, and the night moved forward. Even though the entire world was still stuck on the moment that had just shattered live television, the ceremony continued, but the moment that burned into cultural memory that night wasn't just the slap itself. It was what came after. Will Smith standing on stage, holding the Oscar above his head, smiling, while the audience gave a standing ovation. The applause filled the room, but there was a strange tension in the air. Many people clapped, while quietly wondering what exactly they were applauding. Within days, the full fallout began. The Academy launched formal disciplinary proceedings. Public statements started appearing from comedians, actors, directors, and producers across the industry. Many of them had worked with Will for years, but now they found themselves in a position where silence looked like approval. Chris Rock chose not to press criminal charges that night, but later when he spoke about the moment during his comedy shows, the response carried. A controlled anger that hit just as hard as any courtroom action could have. Meanwhile, the pressure around Will Smith kept building. Before the Academy could formally expel him, Will announced that he was resigning from the organization. Soon after, the Academy made another decision. He would be banned from attending the Oscars and all Academy events for 10 years. Then the industry reaction began to spread quietly behind the scenes. Projects that had once looked guaranteed suddenly slowed down or disappeared. The film Fast and Loose at Netflix was quietly shelved. Bad Boys 4 stalled. Development deals that once moved smoothly started freezing in place. For more than 30 years, Will Smith had been one of the most reliable stars in Hollywood. The business machine around him had always moved fast and confidently. Now, almost overnight, it stopped. Not with dramatic announcements or loud public rejection, but with silence. Calls weren't returned, meetings didn't get scheduled. Conversations that once flowed easily between collaborators simply faded away. And for the first time in his adult life, the man who had always been surrounded by attention, opportunity, and admiration suddenly found himself standing in a very different position, a position that felt unfamiliar and very, very quiet. After everything collapsed, Will Smith stepped away from the spotlight completely. Reports surfaced that he traveled to India and spent time at private retreats and quiet locations far from Hollywood, places where cameras rarely reached and where the noise of the entertainment industry couldn't follow him. For someone who had spent his entire life surrounded by attention, that silence was unfamiliar territory. In many ways, it was the one thing he had always tried to avoid, but now it was unavoidable. Later, Will described that stretch of time as one of the most painful periods of his life. Not because of physical suffering like injuries or illness, but because he was finally forced to sit alone with himself. No audience, no performance, no bright smile, holding everything together for the first time in decades. There was nowhere left to run. And what came out of that stillness wasn't a neat or simple story of regret. It was more complicated than that. Just months earlier, he had released his memoir, Will, in late 2021. The book was written before the Oscar incident, but after the slap, people started reading it with a completely different perspective. Inside its pages, Will spoke openly about his childhood, the tension in his family, the drive that pushed him to succeed, and the pressure that followed him through fame and marriage. It was one of the most vulnerable things he had ever shared publicly. But the Oscar moment revealed something uncomfortable about vulnerability. Writing about wounds and truly healing them are not always the same thing. A person can explain their struggles clearly, understand them deeply, and still react to them in a single unguarded moment. In that instant on stage, the boy from Overbrook who once promised himself He would never repeat the violence he saw growing up, had crossed a line in front of the entire world, not in a complicated way, but in a very direct one. Anger moved through him and into another person. Afterward, Will issued a public apology to Chris Rock, to the Academy, and to viewers around the world. The message sounded sincere and thoughtful, but the response from many people showed something important. Sometimes apologies matter, but they cannot immediately repair a moment that millions of people have already watched unfold. Chris Rock eventually acknowledged the apology, but he did it on his own time and in his own way. He made it clear that he wasn't rushing into a conversation just because the world expected one. In many ways, the urgency belonged to Will Smith, not to him. Meanwhile, the silence around Will continued to stretch. Months passed. Then a full year. Then the timeline started moving toward 2 years away from that night. During that period, something interesting began to happen in public opinion. At first, the reaction online had been almost completely unified. Social media moved quickly, and the judgment was immediate. But over time, the conversation started to split. Some people continued to criticize the moment strongly. Others began to question whether the professional fallout had grown larger than the incident itself. They pointed to Will Smith's decades of work, the impact of his films, and the honesty he had shown in his memoir. To them, the argument was simple. 1 second, no matter how serious, should not erase an entire lifetime of accomplishments. But while the public debate shifted back and forth, Will Smith himself was dealing with something much more personal. With the noise of fame gone, the distractions removed, and the applause completely silent, he was left facing the one question that had followed him since childhood. Who is he when there is no audience watching? That kind of question doesn't get answered quickly. It doesn't come from a stage, a red carpet, or another emotional speech. Real answers come from somewhere quieter, from long periods of reflection, from discomfort, from the slow and often unglamorous work of facing your own actions without excuses or applause. The fall had been undeniable. Now the real question was something else entirely. Not whether Will Smith had fallen, but whether he could truly rise again. The real question now wasn't simply whether Will Smith could come back. It was whether the man who eventually returned would actually be worth the return. And the road back didn't start the way celebrity comebacks usually do. There was no big press tour, no carefully arranged interview designed to repair his image, and no publicist-controlled campaign testing whether the public was ready to forgive him. Instead, it started quietly. No cameras, no headlines, just the slow, uncomfortable work happening behind closed doors. For the first time in decades, Will wasn't trying to rebuild his career, he was trying to understand himself. That meant dismantling the identity he had been building since childhood. The charming performer, the unstoppable success story, the man who could win over any room, and asking a difficult question. If all of that disappeared, what was left underneath? Part of that process involved therapy. Will had explored therapy before, but this time it came with a very different level of honesty. The strategies that had helped him succeed everywhere else didn't work in that room. Charm doesn't impress a therapist. Big smiles don't end the conversation. A therapist simply sits there and waits. For someone who had spent 50 years filling every quiet moment with energy, jokes, movement, and performance, learning to sit in silence became a challenge of its own, and in that silence, certain truths started rising to the surface. The same patterns he had written about in his memoir were still there. The memories from childhood, the tension he witnessed growing up, the promise he made to himself that he would never repeat the conflict he saw at home, and the deep hunger for approval. The same drive that pushed him from the mailroom to the Oscar stage had also been quietly shaping nearly every decision he made along the way. For years, those deeper wounds had been pushed aside. Success buried them. Awards distracted from them. Applause covered them up. But once the applause stopped, everything changed. When the empire slowed down, when the spotlight faded, and when the noise of fame disappeared, Will Smith was left alone with something he had avoided for decades, just a man sitting with his own reflection. And the old wounds were still there, exactly where he had left them. One of the most powerful parts of that reflection led back to his father, Willard Smith Sr., who passed away in 2016. In the final years of his father's life, their relationship had changed in a way younger Will never could have imagined. As Alzheimer's disease slowly took hold, Will became his father's caretaker. The same man who once seemed larger than life, strict, powerful, impossible to impress, was now vulnerable. Will helped care for him, helping with daily routines and sitting beside him through the long, confusing final stages of the illness. And through that experience, something shifted inside him. For the first time, he began to see his father not as the overwhelming figure from childhood, but as a human being. A flawed man with his own struggles, doing the best he could with the life he had been given. That realization became an important piece of Will's own healing. Because understanding his father also meant understanding himself. He wasn't defined by his father's anger, and he wasn't defined by the slap on that Oscar stage either, but he also couldn't pretend those moments didn't exist. Real growth meant facing every part of the story honestly, without hiding behind performance, fame, or a perfect public image. Through all of this, Jada remained part of his life. Their marriage, which the public had declared finished more than once, continued in its own complicated and deeply private way, refusing to fit the simple narrative the outside world kept trying to write for them. Their relationship never turned into the kind of clean fairy tale ending the public often expects. There was no simple reconciliation story and no dramatic moment where everything suddenly became perfect again. Instead, what remained between Will and Jada was something far more complicated and far more real. Not a tabloid headline, not a romantic fantasy, but two people who had built a life together that was layered with history, family, pain, growth, and shared responsibility. A relationship too complex to be reduced to a quick public verdict. Jada has spoken openly about what keeps their bond alive. According to her, the key isn't perfection, it's honesty. The kind of honesty that can feel uncomfortable, messy, and sometimes painful. Not the polished performance people expect from celebrities, just the truth. Over time, Will has slowly tried to lean into that same approach. Instead of presenting the version of himself he thinks the room wants to see, he has been learning to show up more honestly, even when that honesty feels awkward or incomplete. Meanwhile, their children have grown into lives that carry their own identity. Trey, Will's oldest son from his first marriage, has always lived slightly outside the spotlight compared to his siblings. Being the child from the earlier chapter of Will's life came with its own unique challenges, but he has carried himself with a quiet dignity that reflects the care both Will and his mother, Cherie, worked to give him. Jaden, who many people first remember as the young boy in the pursuit of happiness, has grown into a musician, entrepreneur, and creative figure with a voice very much his own. And then there's Willow. She has become one of the most artistically fearless members of the family. Through her music, conversations, and willingness to openly express whatever she's feeling, she has carved out a path that reflects the bold creativity both her parents encouraged. During this period, Will has spoken about his children with a different kind of emotion. Not just pride, but a deeper tenderness that comes from watching them grow into their own lives. The way Will spoke about his children started to change in a subtle but powerful way. Before, the focus often sounded like pride in their achievements, what they had built, what they had accomplished. But over time, his words shifted towards something deeper. Now he spoke more about who they were as people. It might seem like a small difference, but for someone who spent decades measuring success through awards, headlines, and box office numbers, that shift meant a lot. Will Smith was beginning to understand that his real legacy might not be a golden statue or a billion-dollar movie. It might be the kind of human beings his children grow into and the values they carry forward. Professionally, the distance from Hollywood slowly started to soften as well. The film Emancipation, which had been shot before the Oscar incident, finally released in late 2022. The performance itself was widely considered strong, intense, and committed, but the reaction around it felt complicated. audiences and critics were still processing everything that had happened. Some people focused on the film. Others couldn't separate the work from the controversy surrounding the actor at its center. In many ways, that became one of the harshest professional consequences of the slap. Not just the official punishments or industry reactions, but the way it changed the atmosphere around every project connected to him. Suddenly, it became difficult for people to evaluate the work on its own without the incident hovering over it. Still, Hollywood never fully shut the door. In 2024, Bad Boys Ride or Die arrived in theaters and performed strongly at the global box office. It wasn't treated like a dramatic comeback story or a grand redemption moment. Instead, it felt quieter than that. A signal that many audiences, sitting in dark theaters far from social media debates, were still willing to watch Will Smith on screen because the bond between a longtime movie star and the public that grew up with him is rarely simple. It's complicated, resilient, and often more forgiving than the loud certainty of the internet. Despite the controversy and the years of public scrutiny, Will Smith's financial world remains incredibly strong. Most estimates still place his net worth somewhere around $350 million. The homes, the production company, the investments, the business deals. Much of the empire he spent decades building is still standing. In other words, the financial consequences of that night were not the same as the moral and personal ones. Money can protect a lifestyle, but it can't repair everything. And Will Smith, now in his mid-50s, has started speaking about that reality with a noticeably different tone. In recent interviews, he talks about wealth almost like someone who has learned the limits of it the hard way, because even a $350 million fortune cannot buy the one thing he spent most of his life chasing: the quiet feeling of simply being enough. Not loved for the jokes, not admired for the blockbuster hits, not celebrated for awards, music, or record-breaking films. Just accepted for the imperfect human being underneath all of it. In some of his most reflective conversations, Will has described the Oscar incident as the most expensive lesson of his life. Not expensive because of lost deals or paused projects, but because of the trust it cost him. Trust from the public. Trust from colleagues who had worked beside him for years, and perhaps most painfully, the image it created for his own children, who had to watch their father at his worst moment broadcast across the entire world. Rebuilding that kind of trust isn't something that happens with one apology or one new movie. There's no deadline, no final stage where the work is finished. Instead, it's something much quieter, a daily choice to show up with more honesty, more patience, and less performance than the day before. And maybe that's the most accurate way to understand where Will Smith stands today. Not defined by box office numbers, not by whether his public image fully recovers, but by the smaller evidence of a man who may actually be changing because of what he went through. The boy from Overbrook who once promised himself he would never repeat the violence he saw growing up has spent years coming to terms with the night he crossed that line. It's a reality that doesn't disappear just because time passes. For most of his life, Will Smith built a career on a powerful belief that joy was possible for anyone willing to work hard enough to reach it. His energy, his confidence, and that famous smile helped sell that message to the entire world. But over time, he discovered something different. Real joy, the kind that isn't performed for cameras or audiences, requires something he spent decades avoiding: stillness. And learning to sit in that stillness has been one of the hardest lessons of his life. The smile is still there, of course, but now there's something different behind it. Something that cameras, scripts, and performances could never truly manufacture. A man who has stopped running, not because the road suddenly ended, but because he finally started understanding what he had been running from all along. And that realization, even if it arrived later than he might have hoped, becomes the only place where real change can begin. Will Smith's story doesn't fit neatly into the simple narratives people usually want. It's not just a warning story. It's not a clean redemption arc. It's not a perfect hero's journey or a villain's downfall. Those stories are easy. This one is messier. In many ways, it acts more like a mirror, A mirror for anyone who has ever built their identity around what they can achieve instead of who they truly are. Anyone who kept chasing the next success so fast they never stopped to ask why they were running in the first place, and anyone who loved someone deeply yet still struggled to truly see them. Every person has felt it at some point. The quiet awareness that the version of themselves they show the world isn't always the same version that wakes up at 3 in the morning with heavy thoughts and unanswered questions. Will Smith isn't unique because he has flaws, everyone does. The difference is that his most painful moment unfolded in front of millions of people watching live. His fractures became public in a way most people will never experience. But the real question his story leaves behind isn't simply what you think about him. The deeper question is what his story reveals about you, about the armor you wear, about the role you play in front of others, about the things you keep running from, and the day they finally catch up. On the biggest stage in the world, during what was supposed to be the greatest moment of his career, Will Smith revealed something raw and human. Not a polished performance, not a perfect image, just the truth. And sometimes the truth hits harder than any blockbuster ever could. If this story made you think, if it challenged the way you see success, fame, or even yourself, then take a second to support the channel. Like the video, if this story stuck with you, leave a comment and tell me which moment in this story hit you the hardest. Share this video with someone who might need to hear it. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story. Because the greatest stories are never just about the person on the screen, they're about the person watching. Thanks for being here, and I'll see you in the next video.